Welcome to City Square Podcast, where we talk to everyday people about faith and work. My name is Micah. I'm joined tonight by my friend Mark Edgerton. He's a husband, father, and a system supervisor. He also serves his local church as an elder. He lives in DFW. All around cool guy. How you doing, man?
Good. I'm glad you think so.
Do your kids not think so?
Sometimes. No, actually, I got the comment recently that we're like the cool parents, and that was news to me.
Yeah.
But anyway.
I am not the cool parent. I am fully embracing being a nerd and a dork and whatever else you want to call me. So it's all good. So you've been a guest with us before, but some people may have not seen your episodes. So for those who haven't, would you mind giving a quick bio or just like a rundown on what this podcast is about, your faith and work?
Yeah. So as Micah mentioned, I'm a layman interested in theology and the Christian life. Our previous podcast we've done, I did a couple of online debates, which was a really good experience. So we did, I think, one or two? I can't remember. Podcast related to that. So that was a good time. And then it was one of your earlier episodes when you originally kind of got the podcast going. So,
That's right.
Layman, I serve on the board of elders at my church here in Plano, Texas, and husband, father, as you mentioned, and with lots of interests in various things, hobbies, and the like.
And you have, in your spiritual journey, you were saved. Correct me if I'm wrong. Saved while you're at university. Then you moved from more like evangelical to Reformed Baptist, and now, well, you've been Lutheran for most of your spiritual life, your Christian life, right?
Yeah. It was in college that both my wife and I kind of started making our way back to the Christian faith, and actually it's about 10 years now that we've been Lutheran. Well, 9 or 10, something like that. Close to 10 years now that we've been Lutherans. Nice. I was raised Baptist. She was raised Roman Catholic. We did spend some time kind of in the Reformed Baptist Church before becoming Lutherans.
Gotcha. Sweet. Well, thanks for the bio. Everyone, you're now caught up. If you like this kind of content, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed. It helps us out a lot. And every week we're releasing something so that something similar to this we usually have. We try to get interesting guests on. So if this one doesn't do well, Mark, it's because you're not interesting.
Well,
not because there's anything wrong with the host.
In all fairness, that I was caught off guard with this one by Micah, but that's okay. I'm glad to do it. And glad to get on and chat with Micah anytime. So.
I appreciate that. We have a lot of fun in person and online. Right. So last time we were hanging out, one of the things you brought up was one of the topics that you are kind of exploring and are most passionate about right now is manhood or masculinity or biblical manhood. There's probably other topics intertwined with that, like fatherhood and, how we relate to those in our care as fathers, husbands, all our vocations, brother, son, that sort of thing. But specifically talking about manhood, masculinity. So what do you mean by that when you talk about that as being one of your areas of interest, like just lately?
Yeah. Well, to preface, I wouldn't say that I'm any kind of expert in the area. I mean, besides the fact that I am a man, that doesn't necessarily make me an expert. But um, if you want to listen to an expert, maybe go check out Jeff Hemmer, who recently did a podcast on issues, etc. Within the past few weeks, at the time of doing this podcast. So, well, with that said, I guess my work here is done. Go listen to the expert.
We'll link that, and everyone have a good night.
Yeah. No, maybe I'll kind of add some of my own, hopefully original thoughts maybe here and there. But Jeff Hemmer, I have relied a lot on his work. I do think he wrote a book called Man Up, which I would say is probably the best book that I've read so far on the subject of masculinity. So definitely recommend him to anyone else interested in pursuing the topic further. But to also give a little bit of background, this kind of came up in my own life because, while you're aware that the Allen shooting that happened, several months ago now, basically right in my backyard, just a mile down the street from where I live, which really affected the community in a significant way. Obviously, 9 people, eight people murdered, nine dead, including the shooter, something like that. Well, it really had an impact on the community and myself as an individual. And one of the things that it really got me to thinking about was just, my family, protecting them, recognizing that as being one of my duties as a father, which then one question led to another. Okay, fathers, men, they protect. Well, what else do fathers or men do? And so that's really kind of what, just to give a quick introduction to how I got onto this topic, or why I really started to take an interest in it. But when I talk about manhood or masculinity or manliness, whatever kind of word one wants to use, to give a definition, I guess you could say, or to put it simply, from my perspective, based off of the kind of reading and studying and thinking that I've done, manliness is virtue. Or to elaborate on that a little bit, manliness is the living virtuously within a man's vocations. So I mentioned a couple of words there that I think will perk the ears of many of my Lutheran brethren. Vocation and virtue. So I don't know. You want me to go into that right now? Vocation and virtue.
Do
it. So I mentioned vocation, and it's another kind of one of my hobby topics, I guess you could say, because it's a popular word in Lutheranism, right? As you know, vocation. But I think the popular conception of it, it's flawed in some ways. And it was Dr. Benjamin Mays, who is a professor at the Fort Wayne Seminary, who, he wrote a paper on it, pointing out some of the flaws of this popular conception, and which is many contemporary Lutherans tend to think of vocation in a kind of enthusiastic way. And do you need me to define that enthusiasm?
I was going to say, can you define enthusiastic for us? Because that's a non-standard use, I would say.
Yeah, we if you want a little more information on it, you can go back to the podcast that we did, the debate review, the King James KJV only debate review, where we talked about talked a little bit about that, and I think as well as in the debate recap between myself and the apologetic dog on baptism. But in any case, enthusiasm is essentially the seeking of God's will outside of Holy Scripture. And the popular conception of vocation is that, well, so the guy who wrote one of the most popular books on the topic of vocation in our modern day is Gene Veith. And one of the things he says explicitly is that, well, we can discern our vocation from our circumstances. So basically, wherever you find yourself in life, that's your God-given vocation. He also says you don't choose your vocation, which is, there's part truth to that, but it's not entirely true, because actually you do choose your vocations in some cases. So you choose whether or not you want to enter into marriage or to have children, right? You don't, well, some people choose to. But so and this is, it's a dangerous kind of way of thinking, because it gives rise to several questions concerning vocation. So first of all, are we to discern God's will outside of Holy Scripture, or has God actually ordained certain stations in life into which we are to enter? In some cases, we don't choose. We don't choose. I didn't choose to be a son, right? But I did choose to be a husband and a father. And then, if you don't choose your vocations, they're just, God gives them to you, and you are where you are. Well, can you choose to exit a vocation? So, one of the other things is that vocation is overspecified in many instances. So some people will talk about, I have a vocation as system supervisor. Okay, so system supervisor is a vocation given to me by God. Can I enter a different vocation and leave this one? Well, you can see how it causes all kinds of problems, and and I think, I think this will come up maybe more in the conversation, why it's important to get vocation right when we're talking about, what are the stations that God actually calls us to, especially as men, which are those things like husband, father, son, and then virtue.
Okay.
And the reason I kind of say that this might cause my Lutheran brethren cause their ears to perk up is because, well, in Lutheranism, we kind of have an aversion to anything that could be considered moralistic, right? So you and I have talked about this probably plenty of times, that from my perspective, there is an antinomianistic tendency within our own synod, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, that really virtue, or the talk of virtue or ethics, good works, is almost, I don't know, frowned upon is the best word, but maybe non-existent to an extent. So much so that I have a Reformed guy that I talk to somewhat often, and he came to me one time and asked me about Luther on good works, because he was in a discussion with someone else who was making this claim that Luther disparaged the idea of good works, or something along those lines. And Well, anyone reading Luther would never come to that kind of conclusion. So you have to ask yourself, well, how did someone come to that conclusion about Luther? And my guess is that he came to that conclusion based off of Luther's followers. That is, we Lutherans living today, and the kinds of things that we say about good works. So, yeah, I know that's kind of a long-winded response to your original question about
We're starting off the podcast with we're starting off with a banger. Yeah. So if you're still here with us, folks. So within the realm of manhood, then masculinity, manliness, vocation would mean for like people who aren't educated in, like, say, Lutheran terms, because for its size, the LCMS is the largest, of course, conservative confessional Lutheran body in the States. But for all its size, it's not as prominent online or in these, scholarly kind of pop culture evangelical discussions. I'd say that's heavily dominated by Baptists, Presbyterians, that sort of thing. Kind of like the Gospel Coalition, Tim Keller. Those are kind of the people that, or the organizations, or the people that are thought of, kind of, John Piper, some of these guys. So for when you say vocation, you're meaning our roles, in a sense, of who we are as people in all the various aspects of our life. Is that an accurate way to kind of describe it?
So I like to think of vocation as those specifically God-ordained stations in life that we find in Holy Scripture. So,
okay.
And they're very broad. They're actually, I think the proper way to think of them is broadly. So,
okay.
If I were to talk about my vocation as system supervisor, that would be a very loose sense of the term, not the proper or narrow sense of the term vocation. So if one wants to know what are those stations that God has actually established himself in the order of creation, he should look to the table of duties, which is pretty much always appended to our small catechism. So you have the divine office, the office of the holy ministry. You have the hearers of the word. You have mothers, sons, daughters, fathers, husbands, wife, worker. Those are, I would say, that's the proper way to kind of talk about this idea of vocation.
Gotcha. So it's not narrowed down in the sense of, like, I work at this specific company in this specific role, and that's my vocation. It's more of, I'm a worker to provide for myself and my family.
Right. God actually calls us to enter into, he doesn't call me to enter into the vocation of system supervisor. There's freedom in that. I actually have the free choice to enter into that job or not, in fulfillment, or as a way to fulfill my vocation as worker or husband or father. But there's freedom, like I said, and I can leave it for another job.
Okay.
And I'm not disobeying God if I do either of those things. But he does call us to specific actual vocations, and those are the ones that we really want to focus, I think, our attention on.
So for you, what are those specific vocations in your life?
So obviously, husband, father, son, a worker, a baptized Christian. God calls everyone to faith in his son and to be baptized into him. So that's certainly a God-given vocation. Others, I'm a hearer of the word, a layman, not a pastor, not in the office of the holy ministry.
So to like kind of bring the conversation down to earth level, for you, so talking about masculinity and then how that plays out in vocation and virtue. For you, what would that look like if you were neglecting in the realm, or I don't know if it's fair to say this, the realm of manhood, with you acting out in vocation and virtue?
Yeah.
Give me maybe one or two examples of what that would be like if you were not embracing that or you were neglecting those things.
Yeah. So if we want to put it really simply, the essence of manhood, and again, these are kind of the conclusions that I've come to, right? The essence of manhood is sacrificial giving, or to put another way, selflessness. And the ultimate proof of that is the perfect man, Jesus, who, in the greatest act of God's love, sacrifices himself for us sinners. So, what would it look like? What would the dereliction of duty look like in the vocations to which God has called me? Living selfishly rather than in a self-giving way toward my wife or my children. And so, do you want specific examples? I could give them to you all day long.
We don't. I mean, we can, but
But yeah. So wanting, wanting, I guess, this time, wanting time to myself. Okay, so time to yourself is not a bad thing. But when it's like this, something that you, I guess, begin to, when you start to put that before the needs of your wife or your child. So, you're a gamer, and I grew up playing games, and, I've still played games here and there in my adult life, but, well, I don't know if you know this about me, but I would definitely admit to having an addictive personality. So when I get going on something, I get going on it, right? So, a new game comes out and I want to play it. Well, I start to play it and I'm playing it, and I may even be playing it like at night when the kids are asleep, but I'm playing it into the wee hours of the night, so that the next day I'm dead tired and I'm useless toward my wife and my children. So, that can maybe serve as a kind of example. I think the key takeaway is that manliness, masculinity, in its essence, is self-sacrificial giving toward the neighbor, toward one's wife, child.
Yeah. There's an interesting, I think, point there, is because a lot of there's like the manosphere online, like kind of alpha male.
Mm-hmm.
They're not necessarily traditionalists in the sense they're not Christian or conservative necessarily, but there's a lot of like maybe natural law kind of intertwined with some of their conclusions and some of their stuff. Some of it's about taking responsibility. A lot of it's just being assertive and aggressive. So some of those guys would say, if you play video games, you're effeminate. You're wasting your energy on, when you should be out there conquering in real life. I've seen different takes on that, different versions of that take. But I think there's a good point there is like time by yourself, whether that's on video games or social media or, any one of our kind of leisure choices of leisure that are predominant in our culture. Those aren't necessarily sinful. However, if you are, even if, like, that's a great point, even if you're staying up late to play, to avoid taking time away from your children, but you're not stewarding that well, you're being selfish with that and staying up until 4 a.m., because you got to beat the next boss or whatever. That is actually like that's when I think I would term it as more of like being a poor steward of that. You're not stewarding your time wisely. You're not redeeming the time. You're actively taking from the next day, your energy and and in full disclosure, I'm there. This year has been amazing. We have Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, and Baldur's Gate 3, and Starfield. So those are all video games from companies that I have historically loved their games. And usually I don't play video games hardly at all. But this year, man, it has been amazing for me personally, and for a lot of people like me who enjoy the type of games that I enjoy. But I've had to put strict limits on my time because I'm playing when the kids are napping or like in the evenings when they're in bed. But I've got to shut it off at a certain time or else I am going to pay for it the next day. And not just me, but my family as well, because I can be grumpy when I don't get enough rest. Let's say that.
Yeah. Well, then this is where the whole idea of the cultivation of virtue comes into play. Temperance or moderation, prudence, wisdom, to know when to stop, or the kinds of limits to place on things. This is why I say that I like to think of masculinity in terms of cultivating virtue within those masculine domains or callings or vocations.
Yeah. So you're not saying don't ever have fun. You're saying,
oh no, not at all.
Restrain yourself appropriately, and because your first responsibility is to lead and shepherd your family, in a sense.
Yeah. Yep. Or to serve faithfully in those vocations in which you are current, the ones that you're currently in. So, obviously not all men are married.
Hashtag not all men.
Not all men. Is that a hashtag? You'll have to tell me about that one later. I'm not familiar with that one.
You're not chronically online? What are you talking about?
I learn all my internet lingo from you.
I'm sorry in advance. All right, so cool. So let's talk about then, is this a problem in our culture? We can talk church culture. We can talk broad, like America, USA, Texas, whatever context. Is this a problem? I'm guessing
Absolutely.
I know the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think anyone living in 21st century America will recognize, most people are familiar with the statistics of fatherlessness and the effect that has on children and things like that. It's just complete chaos, disorder. We live in a disordered society. But yeah, so men are kind of affected by this in different ways. You mentioned the hypermasculine man, right? The guy who kind of tries to overcompensate, and he does so by assertiveness, but in an unhealthy kind of assertiveness of power or authority. Um, maybe he may or may not get married, and instead, he sleeps with as many women as he can. That's not masculinity, by any means. That's I think you said the word effeminate or effeminacy, which is the opposite of masculinity. It's a selfishness rather than a selflessness.
Yeah.
And so the hypermasculine man is not masculine at all. He's selfish. But you also have other kinds of men. So, for example, uh, Jeff Hemmer, he gives three actually. The one is the man child. So that this is the boy who never really actually even reaches manhood. He's a grown 35-year-old boy or something like that, because he's still, all he does is play video games. So, he lives in his mother's basement. We've all heard that one.
Yeah.
Still living off of others, not really a productive member of society. Right. But there's also just the plain old effeminate man who is, he's agreeable, he's a nice guy. This is like your typical leftist. He does what he's told. He goes with the flow, but not really actually doing so for the betterment of society. So he's going with the whole feminist kind of agenda, right?
So like excessively lazy, passive.
Yeah, passive guy. Yeah, like just your typical leftist guy who's out there advocating for abortion or something like that, right? So those are the kinds of so-called men that this anti-masculinity or this assault on masculinity results in, that we've seen in our culture.
Yeah. So you've got, this is reminding me of something that I saw tonight. This is a tweet from, some guy on Twitter, right? Or X as it's now known. And this is his version of a high value man. Now, this may have just been clickbait. This may have been, a engagement farming post. He says a high value man is a bachelor in his 40s and 50s, has a vasectomy, child-free by choice, travels extensively, reads voraciously, swims in the sea every morning in the sunshine, enjoys the very best of life, unfettered by the concerns and responsibilities others have.
That has to be some kind of parody, or
I don't know. It seems like it, but I think he's serious.
Yeah. Oh boy!
And there's other takes like that as well.
Yeah,
so that's like a alpha male kind of completely self-centered, right? And we're dealing primarily with men on this episode, so we could go into how social media makes or reveals narcissists. But
yeah. So yeah, like this is kind of a. Did we talk about this when we last got together? Kind of one of my high horses, I guess you could say, is I'm no stranger to social media or online theology debates and stuff like that, but you just kind of get the feeling. I don't know if you've gotten this feeling that so many of these guys on there involved in this kind of discussion and debate, you just have to wonder, is that all they're doing? And not just to be judgmental, but just to kind of be observant. Like if you think online debating for the sake of online debating is good, and you're not actually pursuing those God-given vocations, those God-ordained stations, which our theology should actually direct us to, because theology is meant to be practical, not merely theoretical, then you also are acting as a kind of effeminate boy.
Yeah.
You're not actually pursuing those things that God would have you to really be doing.
Yeah. And just to clarify, effeminate in the context of being applied to a male is not the same as calling someone feminine, right?
Right. Yeah, because femininity is actually good for a woman, just as masculinity is good for a man.
Right. So for a man to be effeminate means he is being unmasculine in those certain ways. So
yeah, definitely want to make that distinction.
Yeah, because I think I've seen people just throw that around. Like there's a form of like kind of hyper trad. Every movement has its hyper trads. There's the reformed kind of theo bros who will straight up like they'll tell women on Twitter or Facebook to like go get your husband. Like I won't converse with you. You need your husband to explain it to you. Kind of like just absolutely obnoxious. Women are easily deceived, so go get your husband. It's like, boy. So I've seen that in multiple movements. I don't want to just single out the Reformed. But that, anyways, I don't forget where I was going with that, but I saw that today. I saw some people just absolutely being super ugly. And it just boggles my mind, how they think that is like being masculine. When is that how Jesus treated the women that he had in his life?
Right.
No. Like we had Mary. I was just listening to a talk on Mary and Martha. Mary was listening to Jesus, doing theology essentially, while Martha was,
the better part. Yeah.
Right. So, and it's like, and these are people that I've seen interacting, and it's like they are either Reformed or Lutheran women who are either complementarian or patriarchal in a sense, traditional gender roles. They believe in male only ordination, and men who should be their allies are saying, go get your husband. I won't speak, I won't speak to you. And that's not them being serious. That's them trying to, use rhetorical tactics to, assert their dominance or whatever. It's just, it's very silly.
Which is easy to do, behind a computer screen. Right.
Yeah.
And what they ought to be doing is getting out there in the world and actually being men. And, how are you going to find a wife, a mate, with that kind of character?
Yeah.
Be a difficult one.
I think so. Yeah. Some of them may already be married, but I think, the online discourse is just a snapshot of what real life is. It's not completely disconnected from real life. In many ways it is, but not in every single way. Often that can kind of radicalize people, because they are, there's not the same accountability structures in place on Twitter, X, or Facebook, or wherever you are,
right,
that there is online, or that there is in real life. So people have a tendency to be more rude online, I think, more direct. Fun times. So now that we've solved the problems on social media, how these issues. Okay, we have fatherlessness. We have men who are, at the very least, lazy and passive most of the time. I think that's probably the path of least resistance for many men. Some men, are actively brutal and evil. Those are all both in sins of kind of commission and omission, in a sense. Those are all ways that men can kind of abdicate their responsibility, or they don't cultivate virtue. They don't pay attention to their vocations. They don't steward their resources, their family, their friends well. So what do you see, maybe in general, and then we can get into specifics, but what do you see as solutions, like more practical solutions on how to solve those kind of particular issues? Because it seems, for some people, it could seem like we're saying, oh, there's a middle way, right? A squishy middle, fence sitters. You want to be not too passive, not too aggressive. We could get into kind of excessive details and qualifications. But what do you see as maybe some practical things that men could do, regardless of whether they're married or have kids, to work on this sort of thing?
Yeah. So, and this kind of is related to, just the points that we just were discussing. People online, the way that they treat people online, the way that that's kind of like their world. And it starts with the church. It has to start in the church, and the church as a community with a culture that intentionally serves toward character formation. And so, basically, to answer the question, where do we learn how to be men? We ought to be learning it in the church. And I mentioned the antinomianistic tendencies of our own church body, and it doesn't serve men well. It doesn't serve me well. It doesn't serve our church body well, because that is where we are supposed to be learning how to live the Christian life. And yet, oftentimes, the Christian life or how to live it, is nowhere to be found, because, like I said, those antinomianistic tendencies. And for those listening, what I mean by antinomianism is specifically a rejection of the third use of the law. So oftentimes you'll hear of antinomianism described as the rejection of the law for use in the life of the Christian, which is in a way correct. It's almost kind of, but it's there's a subtle difference there, I think, because that's to say that the law does not serve in any capacity in the Christian life. But whereas I think the proper way to talk about antinomianism is specifically the rejection of the third use of the law in the life of the Christian, which is that use of the law which tells us how to, what works are pleasing to God. And the works that we're to be doing as Christians, now that we've been redeemed by the Savior. And when we think of it that way, we can see how, even if churches are not outright explicitly rejecting it, saying things like, that we just reject the third use of the law, we can see how they kind of functionally or practically in other ways, if not reject, undermine it.
How
So,
so?
to give an example, this idea that the law always accuses, always, no matter what, ever. This idea that the law always accuses, so that now, if the law always accuses, then how are my good works ever pleasing to God? Well, they are pleasing to God, but can they be pleasing to God while the law is still accusing me? No, I don't think so. So, and for anyone kind of unaware with this of this discussion within our church body, the accusation of the law, that's the second use. So, this idea that the law is always functioning in its second use, even if it's functioning in its third use, it's still functioning in its second use. This is a subtle form of antinomianism, because you're basically saying that, and actually I've heard or read, I guess you could say, Lutheran pastors online refer to it as the so-called third use of the law, because they're so attached to this idea that the law is really always just functioning in its second use, and so even in its third use, it's just functioning in it's just the second use, but for a Christian, which is really detrimental, because then we're no longer giving moral guidance to people, to the members of our congregations. We're no longer telling them, now go, this is how you should live your life. To give another example, well,
Yeah.
so our sermons, and this is the way a lot of our pastors are taught to preach sermons, is you have a text before you, so the lectionary text. You got to find the law in the text. You got to find the gospel, and then that's your structure. So you have the law, the gospel, and then that's it. So you kill the sinners, the members of your congregation, with the second use of the law, and then you preach the gospel, and they're raised to new life, and then, well, they're left there sitting. Well, now what? Now what do I go do? And there's a great chapter in a really good book by a professor at our St. Louis seminary, Dr. Joel Bierman. The book is called A Case for Character Toward a Lutheran Virtue Ethics. And the first chapter is just gold, because he paints this picture perfectly, and I swear it is that it's an accurate representation of like 95 probably % of our congregations in the LCMS, because that's how they're trained in seminary.
So do you think I know that sometimes church bodies can be a little isolated from each other. But do you think there's some sort of, is this partially a reaction against the excessive, like, law heavy preaching that comes out of like some Reformed Baptist camps, some big evangelical camps, like the 12 ways to bulletproof your marriage, and kind of the more Bible as a moral guidebook and how to live your best life now?
Well, it's specifically, I think, a reaction to the pietistic movement within Lutheranism, which
I will say has bled into other denominations as well.
Yeah. So,
okay.
Yeah. But I'd rather be a pietist than an antinomian any day of the week, if I'm being honest. I'd rather make too much of God's law and the fact that he desires of us virtue and piety and holiness and good works toward our neighbor than to denigrate them in any way. And Luther himself says in our large catechism that the 10 Commandments are one of the greatest gifts of God to men. But we don't really think that way anymore in LCMS today.
So this is interesting because I grew up in a very legalistic environment as a independent fundamental Baptist with very gracious, loving parents and very non-hypocritical parents. So my home life and my church life as a child was a little different from college and the churches I was involved with around that time, which were extremely legalistic and hypocritical. So this is where I think the discussion is interesting, because I, having been kind of burned by the excessive moralization, legalism, functional legalism, maybe not theological legalism, but functional legalism. They're not saying you're justified by your works. They're saying you're sanctified by your works. You're only your works, essentially. The Holy Spirit is non-existent in many conversations there. So where's the balance between falling into legalism or pietism and because there is a correct way, right? There is maybe the narrow way, you might say. You don't want to fall into the ditch of antinomianism or of legalism. How do you thread that needle?
This is actually one of the reasons why the whole teaching on the third use of the law is so important, because what the third use of the law is, again, is to tell us what works we are actually supposed to be doing as Christians. But so then on the flip side of that, it also tells us what are those man-made works that are not actually commanded us by God, so that we don't fall into Pharisaical or monkery. So like at the time of the Reformation, one of the big things was the man-made works of monasticism that were supposedly to earn favor with God. So the third use of the law, actually properly understood, is that narrow guide that serves to keep us falling off of either end or into either ditch. One where we Antinomianism, which is, we're freed by the gospel, we can live however we want. Or on the other side, so we don't make up works that we think are going to be pleasing to God, but we're actually doing those works that God desires of us.
I'm thinking of a couple examples. Would you say on the side of proper understanding of the law is we don't make laws where God has not made laws?
Absolutely.
In a sense of, I'm thinking of particular set of Reformed Theobros who kind of go real hard after women's issues. They'll go on rants about yoga pants or women in sports, like in sports at all. Whereas I think we could all argue that there's modest clothing, right? There's modest clothing and immodest clothing. There's also the appropriate use of sports and athletics and, interests, physical interests. I don't know if anyone really wants to see women beating each other up in the octagon. At least Christian men, right? Probably shouldn't have that. But that is an area like say a woman in professional or amateur sports or something, that's kind of like an area that there's not a lot of hard and fast actual examples in scripture. So I would be hesitant to make a law for every believer there, or even every person, where I don't feel that the Lord has spoken.
Yeah, one question someone might ask is, well, okay, so which commandment then is that a violation of? I mean, that's really the simplest way to get to and maybe they can fit it in somewhere, but they better have a really good explanation or reason for it, because the Ten Commandments, as a summary of God's law, comprehends that is our guide for the Christian life. Now, it can be applied. Um, again, it's just a summary, and it can be applied much more narrowly and precisely. But you'd better have good reasoning for doing so. So
Yeah.
go take a look at Luther's small and large catechisms, where he very reasonably expounds on the Ten Commandments in very
I will say,
practical ways.
yeah, one of the things that he does, which I have seen others do as well, much later historically. One of the things he does is the Ten Commandments are prohibitions, right? For the most part, they're almost all in the negative sense, like do not have other gods. You shall have no other gods. Other than remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. There's one other one. Honor your father and your mother. That are kind of more in the positive. But Luther, what he does is he spins the negatives around, not ignoring them, but expanding on them. Like, which one would be a good one? I've got it right here. Honor your...
murder.
Okay. The fifth commandment, you shall not murder, or thou shalt not murder, depending on what version of...
Don't take someone's life unjustifiably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Luther says, what does this mean? Well, someone added that. We should fear and love God so that we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and support him in every physical need. So he includes the prohibition is we don't hurt or harm. We don't kill, meaning in self-defense or in just war, but we do not hurt or harm his neighbor in his body, our neighbor in his body. But here's the positive. Help and support him in every physical need. That's third use of the law.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just following the pattern of what Jesus himself does when he says, you have heard that it's been said, you shall not, what does he say? Does he say murder or hate? Or no, he says murder. Yeah, you shall not murder. But I say to you, whoever hates his brother in his heart has committed murder already. Or you've heard that it's been said, not to commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever lusts after a woman has already committed adultery in his heart. So, yeah, he's taking the law and explaining it spiritually and applying it to the fact of life, that the fact that we have to live here in this world, even those of us who've been born again, converted, we need to know how to live rightly before God and toward our neighbor.
Yeah. For anyone who accuses Luther tries to claim Luther as antinomian, indirectly or directly. Like, this is a great place to take them and show that he doesn't. He instructs using the literal law, the Decalogue. The sixth commandment: you shall not commit adultery. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we lead a sexually pure and decent life in what we say and do, and husband and wife love and honor each other. Luther's not an antinomian.
No.
He can't be claimed. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think definitely, just to get back to your original question, it has to start in the church and with some, I guess you could say, reform in our churches. Now, I can't speak for other churches or church bodies outside of ours. I'm only really aware of what's going on in our own.
Yeah. But I have a number of friends in other stripes of Christianity. conservative Christianity, in the States. And that's, I think, a common lament I see, regardless of the denomination, is that they feel either they've observed or they've kind of intuited that the church is not, I don't want to use the word meeting a felt need, because that's seeker sensitive kind of garbage. But there is an element of truth to that, is like there's some sort of teaching or example that men are not receiving in the church, because you see people in the mostly secular sense rising up to kind of fill that void. So people are flocking to Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Yeah. So, I mean, I myself like Jordan Peterson. He's got a lot of good stuff to say. And it's like
I really appreciate him. I hope.
Yeah, meeting a need because the churches aren't doing it. And men are doers. Like we actually want something to go do. Like, give us a mission, give us a purpose. And when the churches don't fill that need, well, the pagans are going to step in and they're going to do it for us. And well, hopefully you're discerning enough to know, where their advice is good, and when you should kind of maybe not take some of their advice. Our churches.
Yeah, I will say, like, I don't follow Dr. Peterson religiously like some people do, and there's others who are kind of in his orbit that are doing similar things. But I would say a really great example in the negative sense would be someone like Andrew Tate, who is pagan in every sense of the word.
Mm-hmm.
Converted to Islam not long ago, ran a basically brothel, cam girl site, and essentially sex trafficked, allegedly, women and girls into, basically he was this is the allegations. Don't sue me, Andrew Tate. That he was essentially a pimp. You've got these people, and there's others in the church space as well in different stripes. There's Michael Foster, who is in the Reformed. I think his church is CREC. He's basically a Presbyterian. I think he's written a book called "It's Good to Be a Man," which I've heard some people recommend and really enjoyed. Some of my Reformed friends. There are, and it's not just pagans, right? I think there's a recognition that is that a word, that there's a problem here.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't need to go to Jordan Peterson. He can offer some helpful advice, and from most everything I've seen from him has been, at the very least, neutral or helpful. But we shouldn't need to depend on people, because we have Scripture, we have the church. Is Scripture sufficient for this or not? And if not, then why are we missing this big piece then?
Yeah, and the thing about the church, like, that's our community. That is our the community within the community is it's with its own culture. So we live in a society. There's the American culture, right? There's Texas culture. There's California culture. But there's the church's culture, or there should be, at least, the church's culture. Part of which ought to be the moral formation of the baptized people of God. And we just kind of don't. A lot of churches are fractured, kind of, too, and in different ways. So our own church, people come from some pretty good distances to come to our church. And then especially over the past few years, like during COVID, that communal aspect has really suffered. And I'm sure many, if not most churches can attest to the same thing. Which is really detrimental because, again, that's where we ought to be receiving that kind of instruction. We shouldn't be having to go finding it elsewhere.
Yeah. Like our church is one of the few, not tiny minority, but like we are actually growing. Whereas a lot of churches are actually shrinking post-COVID. Maybe not drastically, but it's happening in a lot of areas. So specifics. What are some things you are trying? I've got a few things to suggest as well. But what are some things that you are in an effort to build up the church community, spur particularly the men in this instance onto virtue, love, and good works, develop the church community, bring things back in post-COVID world? What are some things you're trying to do, like in your context?
So, first of all, obviously it starts with myself as an individual. I gotta, I guess you could say, talk the talk, or walk the walk. Talk the talk, walk the walk. Because if I don't, then I'm just a hypocrite trying to like burden other people with these ideas. But yeah, so starts with myself again, cultivating a life of virtue and piety, and then within my own household, with my wife and kids. But outside of that, beginning with the church, because that's where it has to start and has to take place. So as a member of the board of elders at our church, one of the things that I helped to get started along with some other guys was just to get our men's group going again. So a men of faith organization within the church, if you want to call it an organization, to actually be productive, to do things. So I like to give this example because one of the things that we do religiously is we go as a men of faith organization is to go on this retreat annually to a Lutheran campsite a couple hours away. And so, lots of guys show up to that every year, get together. We usually fly in a speaker on some kind of topic. We had Jeff Hemmer one year. It was fantastic. Smoke some cigars, drink beers, eat some good food and stuff like that for like a night, and then go back home. But outside of that, we weren't really doing anything. And so I asked the question, well, what are we retreating from exactly? Because at least as an organization, we're not really doing anything. So the first step was just to get guys to recognize that, we're not doing anything. Whereas we have a women of faith who has always been very active in doing many things. So really trying to give life to that organization again, and to direct it in a certain fashion. So to actually establish like a goal or a mission or a purpose for the organization. So in order that we, have a common thing to attain to together, side by side as brothers, in the faith. And so we have a school. Our church, we also have a classical Lutheran school, to give a plug for that. So we decided, well, one of the main things that we want to do is to protect our school, to protect our church, to serve. Men are called to be protectors of their families, of their neighbors. So that's one of the things that we're going to, make it our priority. How can we, as an organization of men, protect our young children in our school, as well as our church? So I'm not going to give details on all of that, but we have a lot of really good. We've made a lot of really good progress, and it's only been like a month or two now. So, but what that will do is it'll connect us. It'll give us this sense of community and brotherly love between one another, and a sense of camaraderie, things like that. The ultimate aim, to grow in faith and knowledge of the one man, Jesus Christ, right? So, what else are we doing? That's the big thing. And all of it's kind of, I guess you could say, corollary. So the things related to it. What are your ideas?
I think, well, I've got a couple. One would be like cultivate good friendships.
Yes. I didn't mean. Yeah, I reached out to you. Did I reach out to you, or you reached out to me first? But
it's been both at different times.
To go back to the kind of personal sphere, not thinking of the church organization. One of the things that I have been trying to do is to cultivate those brotherly relationships with those guys that I have that I'm close to. So one of my brothers whose daughters I'm godfather to, all his daughters, setting, and he lives in Florida, so setting a time to where we actually intentionally, we'll have a video chat once a month. And then another who's godfather to my son, same thing with him. And then with you, we live, not too far, but not conveniently close, to make it a point to actually get together, in person several times a year at least, right?
Outside of I would say outside of like kids' birthdays and events that are not geared toward socialization,
right?
In the deep sense, right? Because there's
specifically
when you have a million,
for the purpose of building, our brotherly bond, right? And then being an encouragement to one another and learning from one another, and then you being a mentor to my son, and me likewise to yours. And same thing with the Men of Faith organization, to initiate boys into manhood, because manhood is not something you just are born with or grow into naturally. It's something that you have to actually attain to, as we kind of
and I think that would be really cool. I've observed this in being in non-Lutheran settings before. Some churches and people are actually adapting or having these kind of coming of age ceremonies, whether it's 13, maybe it's a quinceañera type thing, bat mitzvah. It's
Uh-huh.
inspired by there's elements in different cultures of this, right?
Oh yeah, I've been thinking
Where
about this.
where boys become men, where girls become women. They're stepping into a new era of their life. A lot of
Hmm.
cultures have that baked in culturally. More liturgical denominations, the ones that I'm aware of, like Lutherans, Anglicans, Catholics. I'm not sure about Orthodox, just because they may have it, but we have what we call the rite of confirmation, where you know people are being taught intensively. Kids at
Hmm.
13, 12, 13. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly the age range. It may vary a little bit, but it's usually young teens, unless I'm mistaken. And they're intensively taught through like the catechisms and other materials, and then they're basically received into full membership of the church. Um, uh, so I was going to say that'll be cool to see what you do with the Men of Faith organization related specifically to the boys, the confirmants.
Yeah,
Um,
so it's something that I've been thinking about, and I have some thoughts about it, uh, because I really liked this point. And so I read Josh Hawley, his book on manhood, which is pretty good. I'd recommend it for people to read. Um, but he what he pointed out was that this rite of initiation into manhood
hmm,
actually has to involve something, the basically the possibility of sacrifice or failing,
hmm.
right? Because if
Difficulty,
it's just something,
sacrifice. Yeah.
yeah, if it's just something, well, because manhood is self-sacrificial giving. But if it's just something that you just everyone at a certain age automatically just gets, like, so I don't know of any person who's ever failed confirmation at our church. uh so if it's just something you get like a participation trophy for, and then now you're a man, I don't think that really counts.
Hmm.
And so at this point, I don't know yet. And so my
Yeah.
goal is to have some kind of a good idea by the time my son is old enough. But just to add another point, like, so for example, confirmation, can you really be said to be a man after confirmation? Well,
That's the introduction to manhood. If you're 13 or
yeah,
14,
yeah. So
I brought that
interestingly,
up. Yeah.
at our church, once you're confirmed, you become a what do they call it? A
Communicant member.
giving member or something. So, like, or a
Communicant,
financial
right?
unit or something like that. No, no, no.
Oh.
I'm talking about, yeah, like you're actually expected to give. So there's some
Okay.
sacrifice
Interesting.
there, right? Um,
Yeah.
but one of the other thoughts that I had, and I didn't bring up it at any point, was that it's really difficult to attain to manhood outside of marriage and a family, in my opinion. I don't
Hmm.
see, obviously, some people have the gift of celibacy, but that's the really rare exception, right? We all recognize that.
Yeah.
And so the vast majority of men ought to be aspiring to marriage. And some people aren't gifted with children. I get that. I struggled with my wife to have children for 5 years before we finally had a child, and I fully expected that we weren't going to, but God surprised us and blessed us, and now we have two and one on the way. But outside of those rare exceptions, hopefully rare. I know, like, infertility and miscarriage is kind of on the rise from what I can tell, which is sad, and I don't want to speak ill of those people by any means. That's not my intent here. But, for those who are intentionally avoiding the vocation of marriage and father, that in and of itself, I think, is uh, a rejection of, masculinity. But besides that, it's extremely difficult to cultivate, masculine virtue outside of those God-given vocations. So, I think God gave them to us for a reason, which is to learn to deny ourselves for the sake of others. So,
just as a quick aside on the subject of gifted with celibacy, is a thought I had, and I want you to shoot it down or tee it up. If you're a man who is struggling with sexual sin and sexual temptation, it's probably an indication that you are not gifted with celibacy.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Would you say that's fair?
Oh yeah. Okay. I'd say that's more than fair. I'd say that's
because I think that people say, they want to be like, well, I'm single, and Jesus was single and Paul was single, so that's good enough for me. And they're having a real hard time. Like, I've spoken to many men. I myself am a man who struggled with this in the past. There's a lot of temptation, a lot of opportunity that we didn't have in earlier generations, just readily available, constant,
Mm-hmm.
So if you are struggling with that, you probably should be pursuing, number one, to put that sin to death and to glorify God in your body, but also marriage.
Yep.
Just free advice, guys. Marriage is not a cure for your sin, any type of sin, but it is a place to exercise those passions in a godly manner.
Yep.
So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there because I've seen, I've heard and seen different arguments on that in the past. So, yeah, my thought with the confirmation thing
discern your call. Discern your call from your circumstances. I'll say go ahead and do it in that case.
Yeah. So my thought with the confirmation thing was I've seen some evangelical cultures, and we like to poke fun, right? Because Lutherans baptize their babies and they have confirmation. Whereas like Baptists, they have baby dedication, which is a dry baptism essentially. And then they have, and I've seen in a couple of churches I've been part of, they had these kind of coming of age ceremonies that weren't related to culture, but were just kind of, they were created. They were gathered from here and there. And they were around the early to mid-teens, depending, And I thought, I'm like, that's interesting that there are these churches that are specifically doing things like this in a religious context that are kind of mirroring what the more historical denominations have in place as part of the church organization. But then if we've got you've got your men's organization, that you've already got that structure built there. So attaching something separate but maybe related is not, you're not having to rebuild everything from the ground up, or reinvent the wheel. So
yeah, and having just kind of gotten it off the ground, there are a ton of, I have a lot of ideas. Other guys have a lot of good ideas. One of the things that I've also been involved with at our church is the acolytes, which at our church, the way that we do it is like young boys, in order to kind of, well, what's the intent? I don't want to say encourage them to the ministry. Maybe that's kind of an intent there, but just to give them like a taste of it. I don't know what the best way to say it. But I'd actually like to see that incorporated in some fashion. So young boys, they see this as something to actually attain to, and that's like a step in their journey toward manhood is to serve in this acolyte program, to assist in the divine service.
Yeah.
And then maybe there are other steps. Yeah, lots of really good ideas, but the rite of initiation, haven't quite put my finger on something yet. If you come up with any more ideas, let me know. We'll brainstorm.
We'll see.
Our next.
Yeah. Yeah. So I will say, I'll give it a specific example. One of the ways that we are working on cultivating friendship, as well as good discussions with other men, not necessarily only Lutherans as well. We've got some Reform guys and some others that are just Baptist guys and other stripes. Other Christian, Orthodox Christians are welcome as well. And even people who are not, we've invited some people in who are not, maybe they're lapsed. They're de-churched or unchurched at the moment, but they've, they could be never set foot in a building in their life, or, just life has caught up with them and they're not prioritizing it. Right. So we're not exclusive in the sense of spiritual background, but we are kind of exclusive in the fact that it's people in close proximity to us, either physically or, in friendship. And for us, just as a specific example, that's called Brothers of the Leaf. Most of us enjoy cigars or pipes, something to that effect. I would say almost all of us enjoy, in moderation, tasty alcoholic or adult beverages. And so we got together a few weeks ago, month ago ish. We got together just to hang out. We ate some good food. We had some nice cigars, lots of drinks, alcoholic and non-alcoholic, and just had a great time. Spent several hours in the case of some of us, just talking about life and singleness and dating and marriage and theology and philosophy and everything in between. And that was a great night. So I would highly recommend. Yeah, I would highly recommend that if you have guys in your church that you can kind of begin to create this type of group with. I mean, ours, we're going to try to meet like quarterly, essentially, because we have guys who have to travel in from, 30, 40 miles away sometimes. There's I think it's Church of the Holy Trinity, which is a Reformed Episcopal parish in Houston. They have once a month, they have what they call Cigar and Pipe Club, and it's mostly men, but other people are welcome. Other women and children are kind of welcome on the periphery as well. But it's just an organized time for men to hang out, and that's after one of their services, after their last service. And they call it Pipe Club or Cigar and Pipe Club, and they just spend time toasting, praising God, having a good time intentionally. So there's different ways you can organize it. It doesn't have to be, it can be at the church building. It can be at somebody's house. It can be, your local church only. It can be, whatever combination you want. But I would say organizing something like that, to just start meeting regularly, spur each other on to love and good works, as a very practical kind of specific example.
Yep.
And you can call it whatever you want. You can borrow Brothers of the Leaf, but you can't have it.
Trademark.
Trademark, not by me either. So.
No, yeah, I always look.
But yeah, you find. I mean, Yeah, me too. Okay, so how about? So that's a little bit of specifics. What about resources? We've mentioned a few already. Resources you recommend if people want to kind of dig into what healthy manhood, biblical manhood looks like. Anything you want to plug or add?
Yeah, I think I mentioned the main one. So Jeff Hemmer, his book Man Up, I think for me, it's been like the foundational one where, I've taken, I agree with a lot of his ideas, and taken those and some of his insights and concepts, and trying to apply those in various ways. But actually, some other books I might recommend. Well, I think I mentioned Case for Character by Joel Bierman. Again, another book I would kind of consider foundational for, how should we think about character formation in the life of the church. So, manhood, character formation, how do we do that in the life of the church? But my reading has actually taken me on some other kind of paths too. These are probably more, there aren't a whole lot of, when you read these books, the sections on like, okay, well, now what do you go do, or how to go implement it, tend to be kind of small compared to the rest of the books. Lots of theory. So, I haven't really found the one book where I'm like, oh yeah, this is the one with all the really good ideas for implementing. Still kind of looking for that, but my reading has kind of also taken me on some detours, maybe you could say, because, well, you asked the question earlier about, well, okay, well, we're living the new life. We want to conform ourselves to God's law, His will for our lives. But how do we guard against, legalism or Phariseeism or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah.
So really kind of laying that theological framework for the new life in Christ, or the new obedience. Lots of different terms for it, or how to think of it. And so some good books. Well, some books that I read recently are Jordan Cooper's Christification, which is like his word for the Lutheran concept of theosis. And actually, I didn't talk about this. I kind of wanted to mention this at some point. But in any case, maybe we'll have to do another program on that.
Yep.
and then his book on union with Christ, because so for me, if I were to define virtue, what is virtue? Well, it's been defined or described in many ways. It's you might say, an elusive term, or there's so many ways to talk about it. Really, at this point in my thinking, I might describe it or define it as to live godlike, or to be more like God. So kind of having this idea of theosis, or as Jordan Cooper says, Christification, in the background of that. Any other books?
It's a pretty good list. I would add like 12 Rules for Life as a fairly
I haven't
useful...
read that one yet, but I plan on it. To read that.
Yeah, not from a Christian perspective, but
right. I plan to read Foster's book at some point. Yeah, lots on the list. Actually, I came across this book that I really want to get into, called by Robert Kolb, called Luther and the Stories of God, Biblical Narratives as a Foundation for Christian Living. That's probably the next book that I'm going to read. And, well, there's a lot of related ideas to that, but again, we'll probably have to just save that for another podcast.
I think so. This is fun.
Yep.
And we got to about half of kind of the topics that we jotted down.
Well, there's so many things related to this, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And and I actually haven't put the pen to paper yet. So these are all like I've been reading some books, and I've been having thoughts, but I haven't really had the chance to write anything down and kind of refine my thinking or clarify anything. So hopefully I came across as coherent for the most part.
Once you got going, yeah. Takes time for the engine to warm up.
Yep. Yeah, especially at 11 o'clock at night.
It's true. We are recording this late, but that's what you do when you have kids. And This is a side gig, so awesome. Well, thanks, Mark, for coming on. Thanks, everyone, for watching. We appreciate it. If you enjoyed this, then please share it with someone who would find it useful. Like the video. It helps us out. It helps with the YouTube algorithm stuff. If you're on a different podcast app, we would ask that you give us an honest review, as long as it's 5 stars. And in the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And we'll see you later.
Thanks, Micah.